The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. Our panel for the strategic insights and observations from the Ukraine-Russia war is set. We will be conducting this panel virtually to the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Following the panel discussion, we'll conduct a question and answer period similar in fashion to those previously used. Obviously, we'll have to ensure 100% microphone use or really project your voice. I'll now hand the floor over to Dr. Michael Lynch, Research Professor at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Lynch, the floor is yours.
Good morning. On behalf of Dr. Carol Evans, Director of the Strategic Studies Institute here at the U.S. Army War College, I'd like to thank KCIS for the opportunity to present this panel today. As a quick disclaimer, the views expressed here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense policy. Our first speaker is Dr. Robert Hamilton, who is a research professor of Eurasian Studies at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. He will address three questions. How did each side formulate its strategy for the war? How did it translate that strategy into a war plan? And finally, how has each side adjusted its strategy over the course of the war so far? Our next speaker is Dr. Antulio Echevarria, who is the editor-in-chief of the U.S. Army War College Press, which includes Parameters. Dr. Echevarria will talk about how observations from Ukraine's total defense concept can provide the basis for building an integrated defense, which can in turn help us enhance integrated deterrence. Our final speaker is Dr. John Deni, who is Research Professor of Security Studies here at the Strategic Studies Institute. Dr. Deni will address the role of U.S. allies in supporting Ukraine, the observations and lessons learned from that support, and the implications for U.S. strategy in competition with China and Russia. And with that, I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Hamilton.
Thanks, Mike, and good morning, everybody. So as Mike said, I'm going to talk a little bit about strategy and planning during the war and how each side adjusted the strategy based on conditions in the war. I'll caveat it up front by saying we actually know, or at least I know, a lot more about the Russian side than I do the Ukrainian side. And I think that's true for many researchers in the war. Part of the reason for that is that there are more people studying the Russian strategy and planning process, strategic aims in the war, and how those have been adjusted over the war, over the course of the war, because Russia is a great power and a competitor. And also part of the reason is the Ukrainian side, frankly, has been so tight-lipped. Their OPSEC has been so good. They tell us only what we need to know to help them. And so I feel like, at least for me, my understanding of the Russian side is actually better than the Ukrainian side. But what we've seen over the course of the war from Russia is a contraction of war aims and a more realistic set of assumptions that their strategy and plans are based on. And that's based on the failure of their initial strategy. And what we've seen from Ukraine, I think, is an expansion of war aims based on the incremental success that they've been having in blunting the initial Russian assault and then going on a counteroffensive. So we teach strategy here at the U.S. Army War College as the relationship among ends or objectives, ways or concepts, things you do, means or resources. And so I'll go through what I see as the initial strategy and then a couple of adjustments by both sides. I'll say that from my assessment, Russia's ends or its objectives in the war have remained the same throughout the war. And those are to prevent Ukraine from escaping Russia's geopolitical orbit, reestablish what they see as a zone of privileged interests over the former Soviet Union outside of the Baltics. For a lot of reasons, the Baltics have always been seen differently in Moscow than the other 12 republics of the former Soviet Union. And I think some of the evidence for this is if you look at the pre-war demands, the Lavrov, the Russian foreign ministries, the draft treaty they put forward, Putin's article that he wrote the summer before the war started, those demands were all directed at the West, over the heads of the Ukrainians, right? So the whole denazification, demilitarization justification for the war is clearly not what it's about. It's about It has very little to do with things going on inside of Ukraine. It has to do with Russia's view of the geopolitical space that it inhabits and its prerogatives and rights within that space. So again, the ends were and still are to prevent Ukraine from escaping Russia's geopolitical orbit and reestablish its self-declared zone of privileged interests. The ways in the initial strategy were sort of classic coup de main, right? It was quick seizure of Kiev, capture Zelensky and other key government officials, and install a pro-Russian government. That was the plan. The means, primarily, the military means were primarily airborne special operations forces, and then some of the other irregular forces, the Deterrence from Chechnya, Wagner, and others. The conventional force, the idea for the conventional forces was they could clean up pockets of resistance from the armed forces of Ukraine after Kyiv had been seized, the government had been toppled and replaced with a more pro-Russian government. Some of the assumptions, I think, that guided this the initial Russian strategy, was that Zelensky, the government in Kyiv, were the center of gravity, and I think that was actually correct. One assumption that was wildly incorrect was that Russia could repeat Crimea 2014 on a national scale, essentially that the armed forces of Ukraine would not put up significant resistance, that the Ukrainian people would be passive or welcoming to Russian invaders or liberators in the Kremlin's view. And I think this is evidence that this was not a plan, not a strategy that was developed or a plan that was written primarily by the Russian armed forces and the general staff. This came out of the Kremlin and the security services. There's been a lot of evidence for that. But one of the inferences we can make just from the assumptions that guided the plan were this was not a classic military plan. It had heavy fingerprints from the Kremlin and the security services. So that failed, and that failed by May of 2022. And so the first revision, if everyone remembers, the withdrawal from most of the four axes, the two that were directed toward Kyiv, and really the one that was directed from the south out of Crimea, and a focus on the Donbass, on mostly Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, but also to an extent Zaporizhia and Kherson, and it was the establishment of a Russian protectorate over eastern Ukraine. But the end was still the same. The end was prevent Ukraine from escaping Russia's geopolitical orbit. The way they were going to do this was seize control over eastern Ukraine, essentially try to freeze the conflict and make Ukraine a failed state, or a state that was so unpalatable and unattractive to the EU and NATO that its membership in those organizations would become an impossibility. The other thing Russia did as part of the ways of this strategy was it stepped up attacks on civilian targets. The idea was to terrorize and demoralize the Ukrainian population. And again, as I said, freeze the conflict to allow Russia to escalate it at its discretion and make Ukraine an unattractive member of Western institutions. The means were an expanded conventional force through the partial mobilization that happened in August and September of 2022, and then the aircraft and missile attacks on strategic targets or civilian targets. The assumption here, I think, was the center of gravity was Ukrainian will, which would falter after Russia seized large parts of eastern Ukraine, essentially cut off Ukraine's access to the sea outside of the far west in Odessa. And the population eventually, after being subjected to these strikes on civilian targets, would push the government to end the war. That also proved to be false. Those assumptions failed. That strategy failed. So I think the second revision in Russian strategy, which we see now, and it started probably early this year, again, the ends are the same. The ways, what they're trying to do, I think, is freeze the conflict, retain leverage and the ability to escalate, operationally go on the defense, strategic strikes over the winter you saw on energy infrastructure. After Russia pulled out of the grain deal this summer, you saw strikes on trade infrastructure and grain storage facilities. And again, the idea here is to spread the cost of the war to countries dependent on grain imports from the Black Sea, from this part of the world. Many in the global south, by the way, and I'm sure everyone in the audience knows this, don't really blame Russia for the war. They see it as it's on the one hand, on the other. But the idea here, one of the ideas, is to spread the cost of the war outside of the region so that there is more incentive for countries outside of the region to freeze the conflict and for Russia to retain what it has gained. So I think we're seeing Russia on the operational defense. The means it's pursuing the strategy, again, UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, missiles, diplomacy and information war to erode international support for Ukraine. I think the change in assumptions here, and the key assumption here from Russia is the center of gravity is no longer Ukrainian will, it's Western will. And Russia can outlast, Western will degrade, it will falter. As Russia continues this war, the Russia strategy, I read a recent report that said Russia's strategy now is not to outlast Kiev, it's to outlast Washington. And I actually think that's the most, that's probably, unfortunately, the most realistic assumption in the Russian strategy that we've seen to date. To keep fighting, to freeze the war on the ground so that there are no major changes in territorial control. I think Russia's incapable of major changes in territorial control. I think we're seeing Ukraine is gaining territory, but slowly and incrementally. And I think Putin's theory of victory now is to outlast us, not to outlast the Ukrainians. So what we've seen with the Russians is that over time, the strategy has improved, better alignment of ends, ways, and means, more realistic assumptions, a better understanding of the true center of gravity of the Ukrainians, or of the Ukrainians and their partners that are facing Russia. On the Ukrainian side, I think the ends, initially in the war, the ends were survival. It was retain control of Kyiv, preserve the functioning of the government. This is, two key moments in this are, President Zelensky's, I need ammunition, not a ride. In other words, I'm not leaving. If we can retain control of the capital and the government can continue to function, we can survive the initial stage of this war. And that's really, I think, at the beginning, those were the ends. Those are the objectives of Ukrainian strategy. The other, I think, key moment here is the video that Zelensky and some of his key leaders made a day or two into the war. Literally a cell phone video that was posted. Hey, the president's here, the minister of defense is here. We're here. We're still functioning. We're still fighting. And I think that was key to not only Ukrainian will, but to convincing Ukraine's Western partners that they had a moment, they had some time to marshal support, rally support, and keep Ukraine in the war, because the Ukrainians were going to survive at least the initial attack, the initial shock. The ways are total defense, so mobilization of the entire government, the entire society to the extent it could be. The territorial reserve, sort of an interesting sidebar to this is some of the interviews I've done and some of the things I've read from people in the country have made the point that the territorial reserve was a critical component of Ukraine's ability to initially survive and blunt the Russian offensive. That these were forces that were appearing in places and at times that the Russians had not expected. And they weren't all that well trained or all that well armed, but they were well trained and well armed enough to cause confusion in the Russian ranks and in the Russian plan, and to blunt the initial Russian offensive. So the means I think Ukraine used early on in the war, obviously total defense, but also high volta multi-channel communications, especially in English coming out of Kyiv. And this was directed at us, at Ukraine's partners, to convince us this was not going to be 2008 in Georgia. This was not going to be a 5-day war where the Russians could present the world with a fait accompli. This was going to be a longer war. Ukraine was going to stay in the war. And we had time to marshal support, essentially to get our act together and to step up the assistance to Ukraine, because that assistance would go to good use. It would not be lost or captured by the Russians within a week. Key assumptions, I think, for Ukraine initially were surviving the initial week were key to gaining and maintaining foreign support. Again, lessons of 2008, you've got to fight for more than 4 or 5 days. Ukraine obviously has natural advantages in terms of size that Georgia didn't have, both size of military and size of the country. And that foreign support was key to surviving long term. And initially, there was a thinking, I think, in the Ukrainian government, if you go back to some of their initial statements, that land concessions and neutrality might be the cost of preserving independence. Some of Zelensky's initial statements and initial offers talked about those things. As they survived and as they continued to fight, and as I think they realized that the Russian plan had some fatally false assumptions, Ukraine's ends expanded to, and I think you started to see this around May, around the time that the Russians gave up the drive on Kyiv and started to focus on the east. Ukraine's objectives began switch to a return to the pre-February of 2022 status quo, to pushing Russians out of all the new area that they had occupied since February 22. How they were going to reverse Russia's post-22 February 22 military gains, stabilize the situation through limited counteroffensive. These are the counteroffensives we saw at Kharkiv and Kherson. And then once HIMARS showed up, strikes on key Russian command and control logistics nodes that continued to have to be pushed farther and farther back and complicated Russia's command and control and logistical support. And I think the key assumption in this phase of the Ukrainian strategy was that the center of gravity was Russia's ground forces and their ability to hold ground. And then I think you saw a second revision in Ukrainian strategy about a year ago, about the end of the summer, after early fall, after the offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson had succeeded, and that was a return to the pre-2014 status quo. So ejection of all Russian forces from inside of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, and war crimes prosecutions, and NATO membership. So if you talk to, and I'm sure many in the room have, you talk to Ukrainians now, especially military and political leaders, they will say, hey, we don't fear a long conflict. We fear an inconclusive conflict. And we know that that's Russia's strategy, is to make this a frozen conflict, because a frozen conflict, I think in the Russian mind, and the fear is in the Ukrainian mind, will keep Ukraine out of NATO. And many Ukrainians believe the only way to keep this war from occurring in 5 years or 10 years when Russia is ready for it to start again is NATO membership and the Article 5 deterrent that it would provide Russia. So the ways, how are the Ukrainians doing this? Break the will of the Russian military in Ukraine, counteroffensives to liberate Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, isolate Crimea. I think, and again, this is just me. I don't think the Ukrainians have in mind a conventional military operation to liberate Crimea. I think for a lot of reasons, they understand it would be extremely difficult, would invite a radical escalation on the Russian side. I think the plan is to isolate it, convince the Russians it's untenable, and then go into some sort of negotiated settlement where its status is determined over time, maybe with some international support and intervention. What we're seeing, another thing we're seeing in Ukrainian strategy changing a little bit is these long-range UAV and drone strikes on symbolic and defense industrial targets in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine and in Russia itself, to degrade war-making capability of Russia, to erode the confidence of the military, maybe to send the message to the Russian people that the Kremlin started a war of choice that it now cannot protect Russia from. They've been very careful not to strike civilian targets like the Russians have in Ukraine, because that could actually bolster support for the war, right? By giving the Kremlin and the Russian people ammunition to say the Ukrainians are committing war crimes. So the strikes have been very targeted on symbolic government and defense industrial targets. The means are the expanded ground conventional capability, all the tanks, all the armored personnel carriers, air and sea drones, Western provided long-range artillery, missiles, Storm Shadow, obviously we think was used in the recent attack in Sevastopol last week. The question now, of course, is ATACMS, because that would put everything in Crimea within range of Ukrainian long-range artillery. So I think I'll end here with the key assumptions on the Ukrainian side now. One of the key assumptions is will. Russian will is the center of gravity, not necessarily the will of the military, but the will of the Kremlin. And the Ukrainians believe that the will to fight comes from fear, compensation for the military, because people are very well compensated if they're killed, and that provides almost a perverse incentive for people to sign up because the death benefits are significant. And then the propaganda effort from the Kremlin and its surrogates directed not only to the Russian military, but the Russian people. So I'll stop here, turn it over to Tony, and look forward to your questions.
Morning, everyone. Can I have the first slide, please? Okay, can I have the second slide then? Thanks. All right, so I'm going to talk this morning a little bit about why deterrence failed in February 2022, 6 main answers for that. There are others out there, I'm sure, and none of these are mutually exclusive necessarily. And then the West Strategic Challenge, one of the things I think we have to address if we want deterrence to have better prospects for success moving forward, and a way to achieve integrated deterrence through an integrated defense using roughly the Ukrainian model of comprehensive defense or total defense. Bob alluded to that, and even though it was underfunded and not as tightly organized as it might have been, it did just enough, it seems to me, and to others, other analysts, to prevent the fait accompli. And so I think that's, again, part of the strategic challenge we need to address and so on. So, okay, next slide, please. So, okay, 6 major answers as to why deterrence failed in February of 2022. First one, miscalculation or overconfidence on the part of the Russians. And part of that goes to, I mean, NATO's intelligence gathering was really good. Often that's not the case, but in this particular case, it was. And we revealed to the Kremlin that we knew part of the plan. If you recall, we were a step ahead when the Russians were planning false flag operations and so on. We announced that, and we announced those. So we were a step ahead almost the entire way, and yet the Russians came anyway. So this would have been a form of deterrence by denial had it actually succeeded. It was an attempt. And I'll get into a little more about deterrence by denial and the strengths it might offer for us. But so that's one thing. You got to expect, obviously, your adversaries might miscalculate when you don't want them to, especially. But second one, time not on Putin's side. So this goes back to some of the social science literature on deterrence, all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, and especially in the 80s, where Richard Lebeau was writing. And he says that it seems to him most of deterrence failures were not because your adversary saw a target of opportunity or window of opportunity and lunged, but more that the adversary perceived time to be running out, that the previous measures he or she had taken to achieve their objectives were not working, and that the balance of military power was shifting away from it, was not going to be in his favor. So waiting was not an option. So strike now, or the situation would be even worse. Perhaps wouldn't be able to strike at all. So that does tie into one of these strategic goals that Bob mentioned, which is previous efforts to keep Ukraine from sliding away from Russia's orbit into the Western orbit had apparently failed, and so the situation looked like it was getting worse from the point of view of the Kremlin. Third, lack of will, as demonstrated by use of sanctions instead of military force. Lawrence Freed, I'm sure everyone's aware of his name, but and a lot of literature on sanctions, and more, the most recent literature coming out says they are essentially becoming less and less effective, probably because they've been overused. But so that's a separate issue we can get into. That's going to be probably a separate chapter in the report that I put together at the end of all of this, in any case. And then not using military force. So the other part of it is that usually military force, if used properly, it can be a strong deterrent. We took that off the table, we the West, I think for good reasons initially, and for some other reasons that were probably not necessarily as good, but made sense in any case. There's no reason for us to necessarily jump into a major conflict that nobody in the West really wanted in any case. But anyway, that's answer number 3, the special case. I'm drawing a lot here from Bob. I apologize for paraphrasing a lot of the things he said, but where the Russians see Ukraine as a different sort of thing. So it would have taken us probably more efforts and would maybe cost us more to try to deter Russia. And we did not necessarily appreciate that. So the point of reference for Russia, for Putin, for the Kremlin, different than a point of reference for the West, and we didn't be able to appreciate that going into it. So the lack of focus is the 5th. Andrew Moynihan says, look, we forgot to really include the larger picture, the grand strategic goals of Russia, Ukraine being only the first step here. And without that larger context, our deterrence efforts were not going to necessarily succeed, except by perhaps coincidence or chance or luck or something. And then Bettina Rent's, the inconsistency argument. So the West, NATO especially, has been really inconsistent its approach to trying to deter Russia in recent history. And so why should we expect our deterrence all of a sudden to have succeeded in February, where we were just not sending really strong messages earlier on. And next slide, please. Okay, so none of those answers directly addresses the West strategic challenge, in my view, which is part of what, all of those 6 answers combined with I'll call the 7th one, is looking at this from a strategic and military sort of problem. Whereas the West is always challenged by fait accompli that happens within the first 4 or 5 days or so of a conflict. Think of the Saddam's invasion of Kuwait back in 1989, 90, and the West's eventual response to that. So we're normally out of position to really deter effectively, prevent that fait accompli. And then we like in the middle part of the conflict spectrum. The West has advantage there. Troops are better trained, our doctrines really good. Equipment is superior to pretty much everything that's out there. We're not as good in the protracted conflict phase for various reasons. It's not just the political will that our election cycles change every 4 or 8 years or so. Our larger grand strategic or foreign policy goals might also change radically, perhaps 180 degrees because of that cycle, but also because, and I think the Russians and others had some intelligence on this, but our defense industrial base just was not there anymore to support the massive production, the numbers and everything, ammunition of all types and so on, to sustain a protracted conflict. We're taking steps now to address some of that. We need, I think, a more concerted effort to do that. We've got some of the DoD traffic and everything. Contracts have been let to try to close some of the gaps, but we still have gaps that we're going to deter in the Pacific, China, Korea, and so on, elsewhere. And we didn't have reliable data from a major large-scale combat operation such as this to channel into industry leaders and to really shape the production, the capacity, and production part of the equation. And then we have supply chain issues also that are becoming more and more complex that we have to address. To give you one example, one Javelin round uses something like 200 semiconductors, which I found astounding when I discovered that. And we all know that the supply chain challenges for semiconductors and procuring them, wiring them, and so forth, require some serious thinking in order to solve. So the West is normally out of position in order to prevent a fait accompli. And this one, almost worked. If you look at the recent reports and some of the others, the Russians came pretty close. Remember, the Russians had similar assumptions to the West as far as how long the Ukrainians were actually going to be able to hold out. So it was not really unreasonable for them to have tried this approach. And this is the thing that beats your other deterrence efforts. If they think they can get what they want to get within the first 4 or 5 days, while NATO's sorting out what its response is going to be, and if you haven't addressed that in your deterrence efforts, then you aren't really going to, your chances of deterring your adversary are diminished. So, but we like that. We're out of position, but we like the idea of trying to deter through punishment as opposed to deterring by denial. But by inflicting costs, sanctions, and so on, we are not directly involved in the conflict. We can influence it to some degree. We can manage the escalation side of the equation by not triggering the radical escalation on the part of adversary, by not introducing our own military forces and so forth, that sort of thing. So we are comfortable with deterrence by punishment. But historically, we can see that the deterrence by punishment is really less effective overall than deterrence by denial, by a factor of like 7 or 8. Even though it's difficult to prove whether deterrence works, proving a negative is a hard thing to do. It's also, by the way, difficult to prove that coercion or compellence actually works as well, or what part of your compellence effort was the key in getting your adversary to do what you wanted her to do. So it's more art than science here, but we're able to deduce by historical record the use of alliances, strong alliances. They're not so strong they are provocative, but strong enough they actually can deter conflict. It seems a safe bet to me. You know, it's not, again, it's not a science. So next slide, please. And just flip over to the Pacific for a second to give you a picture of the strategic problem on a larger scale. Lots of literature out there on the Taiwan scenarios and so on. But I wanted you to get a feel for the missile belts, the first, second, third order defensive belts. They're fairly significant. I think getting worse over time, worse from a Western perspective, better from a PRC or Beijing perspective, obviously. And then, according to the LAMPAC conference back in the middle of May, lots of important folks, I think, were talking about the situation, not necessarily getting, egregiously worse for the West at this stage, but there are some concerns, and there are lots of voices out there saying deterrence is beginning to erode in the Pacific. Elder Scobie, famous for his book Strategy of Denial, maybe many of you have read it, I hope, that essentially we are losing the window of being able to move forces in any number into the theater without incurring more risk. Sure, freedom of navigation operations, other are occurring routinely, but that's not the same as introducing additional forces, hardware, and so forth that might tip the balance away from China even further. It may appear to be, according to some of the intelligence reports that are now open source, appear to be worried more and more about what Richard Nettlebone pointed to as the balance tipping away from China, and that sooner rather than later is when we'll have to act. So just wanted to provide that perspective, because whatever we talk about here for Ukraine, ideally, part of it ought to be transferable to other theaters, but the challenges are even greater in many of those other theaters. So next slide, please. So the getting back to the fait accompli, I think the Ukrainian approach, when they essentially rationalized all of their territorial defense forces, I'll call them that loosely, but lots of units fell then underneath the IDF, and TDF, sorry, Territorial Defense Forces as of 1 January, but there were no funding streams set up yet. They had some veterans from previous conflicts with the Russians, but they didn't really have wide-scale, organized, collective training. Nobody was really read into the General Defense Plan. They cooperated with some soft units and so forth. But overall, they appeared to have done just enough to slow down, surprise the Russian fait accompli attempt. And you can see some of the pictures there. We know the National Guard Battalion, or parts of that UK National Guard Battalion at Hostomel Airport seem to have done just enough, knock out the first Russian aircraft that attempted to land there. And roadblocks that were set up. In some ways, they did enough to free up regular Ukrainian forces to do their missions as well. So that's important. Had they been had that system been more routinized, had there been funding streams, had the training been integrated, then I think they could have probably even accomplished more. Others The Finns have a similar concept. The Poles and the Baltic states have a similar total defense or comprehensive defense concept. However, and so do the Taiwanese. However, in many cases, these just really on paper more than in reality. They're not training, they're not rolled into a coherent defensive plan, but they could be. So to defeat a fait accompli, in some ways, you already have to be there. You have to be in position. The West can't push any more hardware into position without increasing risk, as we saw. But it can help those forces that are there. It can help train, it can help supply, and it can help in other ways with intelligence, especially. I think NATO, U.S. intelligence, in the early stages of the conflict were key, not only strategic level, but all the way down to tactical level, down to targeting and so on, were very, very important. And in some ways, that sharing of intelligence, I think, could be the glue that holds together an integrated defense concept in various places, and that maybe do just enough, again, to slow down an aggressor and to buy time for the West to look with a more coherent and stronger response. Some other problems, though, with the TDF, and again, I'm using that term very broadly, even though TDF was a specific organization, but the volunteer forces, with volunteer battalions running around with, in some cases, loyalties that were in a constitution that is not necessarily democratic. We wouldn't necessarily gone out of our way to support them, but they were doing enough to fight against Russian aggression. Some of them farther to the right than we would like them to be. But so I think part of making this a successful concept is a professional education and training program that teach them law of armed conflict, ethical decision making in wartime and so on, which is important in the long term, and loyalty to the state, IEPs, as opposed to loyalty to their own particular individual agendas and so forth. Next slide, please. So to kind of wrap it up, the intelligence sharing, we need to really hammer out concrete policies of how we're going to do this. We have a tendency in the U.S., sometimes for perhaps good reason, protecting our sources, but overclassifying things and being really, really stingy about sharing intelligence, almost to the point that the value of that intelligence, once it is shared, is not as useful as it might have been had it been shared in a more timely manner. So we need to figure that out, and we need to work out with whom and what we're going to share when we know it, and so on. And that would be, again, the industrial capacity problem. We need to fix that. That's a separate chapter, but I just need to mention that as part of how we're going to approach deterring the protracted conflict. And there are some other things there. The integration of territorial defense forces and this total defense concept or comprehensive defense concept is translated both ways. Is not going to be as effective if the Poles aren't cross-border training with Baltic states, and the Ukrainians at some point when their status is resolved, the alliance question is resolved, should also be training cross-border with Poles and so on. And they should be training at both regular and the irregular forces. Integrated air defense networks will be key, I'm sure, moving forward. Pretty obvious. I think everyone would agree with that. A couple Army implications at the bottom there. We are seeing evidence that our approach to training Ukrainians to fight like us is not as productive as we would like. We have to remember that learning air-land battle, we started doing that in the 1980s. We didn't really, it took us about a decade to kind of get it, cycling units through National Training Center and building a culture. It doesn't happen in just 2 or 3 months. So we can't really have expected the Ukrainians to have picked it up as quickly as we would like to. So we need to be able to train proxies and help them fight the way they already are organized in a culture to fighting. And we have to, so we have to figure out ways to adjust our doctrine accordingly so we can do that more effectively moving forward. Consumption rates for LESCO, I think I mentioned already. and scalable ADA, long-range fires, et cetera, training on those. So I will end there. There are some caveats. The security dilemma problem, you don't want to increase your defensive capability too quickly and being too strong to the point that it provokes your adversary into attacking and you end up with the very thing you wanted to deter in the first place. And the threat of militarizing civil society by having irregular units well armed out there and everything who decide to start following their own agenda. All right, thanks. That's my last slide is just to say, hey, follow-on questions, everything, please get in touch with us and please follow the press and its podcast, the SSI. So I'll turn it over to John now.
Thanks, Tony. While I await my slides to come up, again, my name is John Deni. I'm a research professor here at the Army War College. And let me give a little bit of context setting before I launch into my slides. And that, as you can gather from our approach to this issue and the panel we put together here, we're working on a multi-author study. Really, it's going to be a series of studies, what we're calling a federated approach. And there are groups of us or individuals examining different parts of the puzzle. You heard Bob and Tony with their portions. Mike is going to be tackling at least one bit of this, including U.S. security cooperation with the Ukrainians, as well as history relations in that part of the world. The bit that I'm working on is allied support for Ukraine. And primarily here, we're focused on European allies. And I'll note that even though my name is the only one on that lead slide there, I'm writing mine in collaboration with a co-author, Dr. Lisa Aronson. Lisa is my counterpart at National Defense University down in Washington, D.C. She's a research professor there, studies Europe and NATO as I do. And so the two of us are tackling this issue of allies in support of Ukraine. All right, next slide, please. Here's what I'll be briefly offering to you. I'll start broadly, talking about the role of allies in American strategy, why we think we need allies, and then I'll take a dive into some of the details of what we are observing right now. And just a brief note on the methodology that Lisa and I are employing. We're doing a lot of travel, frankly, for this research project, including a lot of personal interviews. We began in Washington, D.C. with desk officers at our State Department and Defense Department, but then grew that to include the foreign embassies in Washington of key allies that we're examining in Europe. We've got a group of about 8 or 9 that we're looking at. You can probably guess at countries that are in that group, including Germany, France, the UK, Poland, Romania, Finland, etc. And then we've done some extensive overseas travel, visiting the capitals to speak to both government officials, as well as academic and think tank experts. And we've also had the opportunity to visit maintenance and material transfer locations in Eastern Europe, including in Poland. So let's go to the next slide, please. Starting again, most broadly, you're going to see unfolding before you here a series of American defense strategies, quadrennial defense review reports or QDRs, security strategies, et cetera, stretching back almost 30 years. The remarkable consistency of all of these documents that you see unfolding before you, from the presidency of Bill Clinton, who was kind of a reluctant, frankly, transatlanticist, given what brought him into office in 1992, through even Donald Trump, who had what could only be described as a challenging relationship with Europe. The remarkable consistency among all these documents is they all have one form or another of this notion, and that is that we Americans prefer to work in the world with allies. And by the way, we prefer to work with Europeans among them. So this has been a remarkable consistency of post-Cold War. I mean, you could even draw this back into the Cold War perhaps, but it's a clear thread through all of these strategies, these documents, going back nearly the last 30 years. Next slide, please. Now, why is this the case? I mean, some of these reasons are going to be obvious to those of you in the room, right? We clearly believe we get more legitimacy internationally, but also domestically when we have allies by our side. The third bullet there is the one that is often most surprising, especially when I brief this topic in Europe. Europeans, many of them, frankly, don't believe that the American military, which is so large and capable, we really need European allies with their, some have called them bonsai armies, bonsai militaries by our side. I think from an American perspective, in fact, we do. We need their capability, we need their capacity. Remember that redundancy is no sin when it comes to national security and military affairs in particular. And so you can think back to the surge in Iraq, the surge in Afghanistan. Those, frankly, would not have been possible without allies by America's side. So this is a very interesting irony of the post-World War II era, certainly the post-Cold War era, and that is namely that the one country in the world with the ability and often the will to change political outcomes anywhere on the globe prefers and feels like it needs allies by its side to do those things. And then finally there, the last bullet, we have historical relationships based upon historical practice, but also culture, in some cases common language, working with our European allies. So these are all the reasons why all those documents you saw piling up on the last slide preach this gospel of allies by our side. So now let's take a dive into what we've seen unfolding now in the Ukraine war. And again, a lot of this is based on research over the last 8 months. Next slide, please. And most of it based upon interviews. First, let's start here with the strategic approach. So what's driving the allies, European allies in particular, again, to do what they're doing in or with regard to aiding and assisting Ukraine? It shouldn't surprise you. You know, we Americans have a strategy for just about everything. In part, that's thanks to the large defense establishment that we have. We've got the personnel and the resources to do that kind of work. Most of our European allies do not. And so many of them, most of them do not have formal strategies for their approach to the war. Instead, they're driven by what we're calling some strategic imperatives or rationales, and they vary depending upon where you go across the continent. Some countries, obviously, those closest to the problem set, you can think of Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, maybe even the Poles, fear that if they don't help, they're next. Others, particularly the Germans, the Finns, very concerned with the rule-based order and maintaining this, especially in Europe. Others are very eager to impose a strategic defeat on Russia. A very small number, particularly the Lithuanians and the Poles, have a cultural affinity for the Ukrainians. And then finally, several allies feel a need to be good partners for Washington. They feel a sense of responsibility. And so they're doing what they can. So there, in sum, it's a variety of rationales that are driving what the allies are doing. Next slide, please. Now, how are they doing what they're doing? The patches you see unfolding on the right of the slide are those of some, not all, of the NATO Rapid Deployment Corps, the gradual readiness corps, graduated readiness corps that NATO has at its disposal. Most interestingly, these command and control entities are not being used. Why is that? Well, it won't surprise you all to know that NATO doesn't want to pitch this, and the West doesn't want to pitch their effort as contributing to some sort of a NATO-Russia conflict, right? They're trying to, frankly, in some cases, downplay the role of NATO. So despite the fact that NATO has the ability to command and control the assistance effort, these entities have not been tapped at all. Instead, what we have seen is a more of an ad hoc approach. Began first with the American 18th Airborne Corps, which was sent over to Europe initially to help handle refugee flows into Poland. When it was seen that the Poles had most of that effort in hand, the 18th Airborne Corps' mission changed rather quickly to facilitating the delivery of materiel to the Ukrainians. After that, after the first few months, an ad hoc organization called the Security Assistance Group in Ukraine was formed. It was initially, it still is based in Germany, but initially in Stuttgart. And it was really based upon borrowed manpower from both U.S. Army Europe and U.S. European Command. In conjunction with that, a UK-led International Donor Coordination Center focused primarily on training coordination. But again, these were largely ad hoc. What we're seeing unfold now, and which should be officially stood up by the end of this calendar year, is a new SAGU entity. It's got its own formal manning document. It'll now, instead of being around 150, 140 personnel, it's going to be as large as 430, 450 or so. And its purpose will be to coordinate all of the material and training assistance that's flowing into Ukraine. We had the opportunity, Lisa and I, to go visit with SAGU personnel there. We've got a quote there from one of our interviews. It remains really a spider web of coordination, a unique bureaucracy. And so this raises the question, well, what good is NATO in this context then? Even though NATO command and control entities have not been used, we still detect in our research that NATO has nonetheless provided the framework necessary. It's sort of greased the skids of coordination, if you will, and enabled a lot of the cooperation to unfold even through these ad hoc entities. But without US, and to a lesser degree, UK leadership, it's really unclear whether the scale and the organization could have unfolded in the way that it did, at least initially in the first year and a half. Next slide, please. Now let's turn to the material assistance and what we're seeing unfold there. It won't surprise those of you who've been following this issue that many of our allies in Europe are, they reached the end of their ability to do more on this front. In fact, many of them have been very public about this. Joseph Borrell, the really person thought of as the EU foreign minister, spoke rather openly about this about a year ago, saying that European inventories were largely tapped out. However, what we've uncovered in some of our research is really a tension in the civ mil terms in some of these countries that we were focused on. I won't go into too much detail here, but we've seen examples, a couple of cases in which the military bureaucracies or military entities in some of our allies are unwilling to turn over more. Now, in some cases, that's for good operational reasons. They're concerned about maintaining an inventory in case the Russians come across the border in their countries. But in some cases, it takes more of a bureaucratic overtone. They're concerned that if they give away some of these resources from their inventories, that their civilian counterparts in capitals simply won't provide the funding to replenish those inventories. And so there's a tension here. Some of the civilians fearing that the military counterparts are inflating the threat. And some of the civilians, frankly, telling us that they've got the capacity to do more, even though their militaries are reluctant to do that. In any case, what we've seen across the continent is an unwillingness to put their economies on a wartime footing. Now, we're not at that point here in the US either, but the Russians certainly are. And what we have in the US in the form of a Defense Production Act is at least the ability to incentivize, even with only the threat of employing the DPA, we can sometimes get industry to react a little more quickly than they might otherwise. These kinds of tools largely do not exist among our European allies. And so they have a hard time, for example, getting their orders with their defense manufacturers to the top of the queue. So this is a problem that we've identified, and you'll see this in our recommendations when our report eventually hits the street. Next slide, please. In terms of training assistance, many of the European allies, including the US, have had long-standing training efforts underway already with the Ukrainians prior to February of 22. Most of the European allies have been eager to continue this. The challenge that we've seen unfolding, though, is that there are multiple training efforts going on. There's certainly coordination happening, and in large part that's thanks again to the UK-led effort to try to corral some of this, or at least provide a clearinghouse for that coordination. But there is no standardization yet that we've seen in those training efforts. One of the challenges, of course, here is that the more training provided by Western militaries for Ukrainian forces, it means necessarily less range time, less opportunities for our own Western forces. And that is a challenge for our readiness. And then finally, there's lots of training, it seems, at the individual and small unit level. We see far less training occurring at the collective level. In part, this is due to a lack of range time at those ranges and those maneuver facilities that have the capacity for battalion and brigade maneuver. Next slide, please. In terms of operational assistance, for classification reasons, I can't go into much detail here, I'll note as an aside that Lisa and I believe my colleagues are probably operating under the same constraints. We're going to publish, of course, an open source, I should say, an unclassified study, but we will also have a classified annex. And much of the information we're uncovering here under operational assistance, as you can imagine, falls in the classified domain. However, I can note there's been some open source reporting regarding non-US intel support being provided at both the multilateral and bilateral levels. Next slide, please. In terms of logistical assistance, the access, basing authority, and overflight rights provided by the Allies for the effort to assist the Ukrainians has really been, frankly, outstanding. It's at a level at which we've been told by our American interlocutors in Europe and in the Pentagon, it contrasts pretty strongly with what we often see in the Indo-Pacific theater. Nonetheless, there are some concerns regarding OPSEC, and I provide two open source examples there. There are several more in the classified realm, but there are two in the open source there. We saw back this past spring, the Poles uncovered a spy ring of Russians or Russian affiliates that were intent on sabotaging some of the rail lines that provide material to the Ukrainians. And then finally, there was a very suspicious explosion at a Bulgarian ammunition storage warehouse in July that Bulgarian authorities believe was tied to the effort to provide resources to the Ukrainians. So nonetheless, the logistical assistance is really a highlight so far. That is notwithstanding news just overnight that the Poles may be slowing down their efforts, perhaps only on a bilateral level, hopefully, but slowing down their efforts to aid the Ukrainians in what may be a growing conflict over the grains trade. Next slide, please. When it comes to measures of effectiveness, the Allies across the board lack really any robust measures to determine whether and how they're being successful. Really, the only measure that was cited to us over and over again is yards or kilometers gained on the battlefield. Now, that's pretty rudimentary. It's pretty blunt, doesn't provide us the specificity we need to refine the training and perhaps even the material and operational support that we're providing to the Ukrainians. Now, in some cases, there's lots of anecdotal feedback, for example, from their embassies in Kyiv, or in some cases from personal contacts between soldiers who happen to know each other in the Ukrainian military and in counterpart militaries. And then finally, we're beginning to see some anecdotal evidence of MOEs filter out from the contractors that are sometimes on site in Ukraine. Next slide, please. Now, what's the so what of all of this for the Allies, and especially for the US and our strategy? First and foremost, there is a risk we detect in terms of escalation. Some allies leaning very far forward in doing what they're doing, either in terms of the materiel or especially in the operational realm. That creates some risks for escalation. But the fact is that in some cases, the American perspective is almost a little schizophrenic here. We benefit to some degree by some allies that have a little more operational freedom, a little more permissive authority to engage in some activities in Ukraine that we are preventing our military from doing. And we gained, frankly, some intel benefit from that. On the flip side, we also see a risk of a burden sharing for the Americans. I mentioned earlier, several of our allies in Europe running out of key capabilities, in some cases capacity, and they'll need to be backfilled primarily by the Americans. Overall, we also see key capabilities, US capabilities in Europe are therefore critical in the short run. It's very clear that if there is a contingency in the Indo-Pacific that the Americans must respond to, the allies in Europe are going to be challenged to a great degree to try to fill some of the key gaps that might be withdrawn from Europe. You can think about long-range fires and other enablers that would have utility not simply in a Europe land-centric theater, but also in the Indo-Pacific and more maritime or maybe even air domain centered theater. And then finally, the implication there, I talked about the command and control. It's really unclear to us, and I think we're really dubious about whether there's any substitute for U.S. organization, command and control, or scale when it comes to assisting Ukraine in doing what we're doing for them. And I'll end there. Thank you very much. You can go to the last slide if you'd like, but that's the end of my content. I look forward to your questions and thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, Dr. Lynch, Lieutenant Colonel Donnell jumping in. We have about 15 minutes here for questions, and so likely about 3 or 4 as long as they're relatively concise, since we got a bunch of hands coming up. And let's go. Let's start here at the front.
Steve Saban, nice to see you, John. Nice to meet the rest of you. Just 2 points. One is for the Robert Hamilton's talk. You mentioned that the Ukrainian war aim has changed. And I can't help but to think about yesterday's conversation about human security, because I think it became more obvious to the Ukrainians that they can't leave any territory in the hands of the Russians if the Russians are going to engage in massive amounts of war crimes. So I think that's made it very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to negotiate any territory away. And I think for the other 2 presentations, there's a key thing about the alliance piece, 2 pieces about it that you guys didn't really hit hard on, but to think about. One is that the alliance has really worked successfully in deterrence, in attacks on the alliance. Right. One of the most notable things about this conflict has been that there's not been a single Russian attack against any territory outside of Ukraine. The one time Poland got hit, it was by stray Ukrainian system, and that's not an accident. And so this is really points to the sort of the miracle of NATO, because wars happen when combatants wishfully think away the allies of the adversary. So Hussein didn't think that the United States would respond, and he had good reason to think that, given April Glaspie's sort of assurances. Putin didn't think that NATO would respond here because he thought he'd be able to win quickly. But that's a sharp difference between those 2 cases and the non-war that has currently existed between NATO and Russia. And that points to a real challenge in the Pacific. So when we want to extend this to the Pacific, yes, the United States has alliances with South Korea and with Japan, but it doesn't have a NATO, and it's never going to have a NATO-like thing in Asia. And so that's always going to mean that whatever Chinese leader is in place is going to engage in wishful thinking and think that the United States is not going to respond, or not going to be able to respond, whether it can or it will. They're just going to assume it's not, because wishful thinking and confirmation bias will dominate. So that's my bit of pessimism, despite the wonderful optimism about NATO in Europe. Thank you.
Next question, is the microphone already out? And then next one in the back.
Good morning, Major Scott Graham from the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. Thanks very much, gentlemen. It's a real privilege to benefit from your views on the strategic challenges facing Ukraine. I wanted to go back to Bob. I believe it was Bob that commented on the will of the Kremlin and the will of the Russian military, and how there might be a little bit of tension competing between those 2 wills. I was wondering if you could comment on whether this is a ripe opportunity to exploit. We've seen a lot of kinetic effects in this conflict. What can you comment on influence operations, information operations directed towards either the Russian military or the Russian population, with a view to change the mindset of the Kremlin to augment some of those kinetic effects? What has been going well, and what can you predict are some concrete steps we can take over the next year to achieve additional successes? Thanks, Bob.
So, yeah, thanks for the question. I think there is a gap between, I think this is an existential war for the Kremlin. I don't believe it's an existential war for the Russian military and the Ministry of Defense, General Staff, and Armed Forces. It's an existential war for Putin. I don't believe that he believes he'll survive something that is perceived as a loss by Russia in this war. And so he's all in. And that's why I said his theory of victory now is to freeze the conflict and outlast us, not to outlast Kyiv or the Ukrainians. It's outlast the West. In terms of information operations, I'll admit I'm not all that well schooled in our information operations directed at the Kremlin. I think the one huge information victory we had before the war was the deliberate declassification of what we knew about Russian plans, which really sort of obviated all the false flags, all the Russian justifications for the war, because I've said this more than once, it's the first time in 35 years in the US military and government I've seen us a step or two ahead of the Russians in the information game. So the intelligence community can maybe be faulted for underestimating the will and capability of the Ukrainians to fight. But again, the deliberate declassification of what we knew about Russian plans was the biggest thing I think that we've done in the information space. And we've retained this lead. We're ahead of them in the information game. I think the Ukrainians have actually been more effective in that because they understand the Russians better, right? I mean, they just understand, I think, the Kremlin, they understand Putin better, they understand the Russian people better than we do. And one characterization I've heard for the reason Ukraine has been so far ahead of the Russians in this war in the information space is this is 40-year-olds fighting 70-year-olds in the information space, right? So not only do they understand it in Kyiv better, they're younger, they're more energetic, they understand the information space. I mean, Zelensky's a comedian, right? Before he was a politician, he was an actor and a comedian. He understands communication. And so I actually think there are a lot of things we can learn from them. I don't know if we will, because I don't think we'll ever be as agile and risk tolerant and risk acceptant in the information space as they are. And I guess I would say, in terms of sort of finding and exploiting gaps between the Kremlin, Putin, and the Russian military in terms of how they perceive the conflict, I think the gap is that for Putin it's life or death, it's existential, or he's framed it that way, and I think he believes it is. For the defense establishment, and probably especially for some of the economic establishment, the oligarchs, and as it starts to cost them money, there may be a way to exploit the difference in incentives there between Putin and his inner circle and the defense establishment, the economic establishment. Unfortunately, I don't think the Russian people should be a big target of information operations because, frankly, the history of sort of popular revolutions in Russia is pretty dismal. Most changes in Russian governments have come from elite splits, not from popular revolutions, right? Even the 1917 revolution, the November one was more of a coup. It was a Bolshevik coup. It was not a popular revolution. It had some popular support, but the Russian people have tended to be fairly passive when it comes to changing the direction of their country through mass action. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that answered it.
Respond to Steve. Steve's question or comment. Maybe I will. Yeah. Steve, thanks so much for your question, your comment. Regarding deterring attacks on the alliance, I'm less sanguine about this. Certainly, the alliance has done a great job of deterring the worst case scenario so far. A fait accompli land grab in the Baltic states, right? That's the one we're most focused on because it seems to be the one that is the most dangerous, the most potentially catastrophic. But beyond that, below that sort of high bar, I'm really less sanguine. I mentioned two examples that are in the open source public realm: sabotage in Poland on rail lines, and the explosion of an ammo storage facility in Bulgaria that housed ammunition destined for Ukraine. One of the benefits of an organization like the Army War College, the U.S. Army War College, in taking on a study like this relative to, for example, any number of excellent think tanks in Washington, is that we bring security clearances whenever we travel. Excuse me. And that's enabled us to have some insights that may not be available to the public. And without going into detail, I just have to sort of end by saying I am just not as sanguine about our ability to deter Russia as I was before I began this research project.
Okay, I think we have 2 more microphones out, but only about 5 more minutes here for questions.
Thank you very much for the presentations this morning. My name's Rachel Grimes. I'm a staff member at NATO, but my question's not representing NATO's thoughts at all. Despite John Deni's kind words about the importance of allies for America. We saw in Afghanistan that if America doesn't want to play, then it's really difficult for the rest of us to stay in the playground. So my question goes to, is Ukraine and are the allies in a race against a potential return of Trump to the White House, working on what he has said or what he has refused to say about his stand on Ukraine? Thank you.
That's a tough question to answer. Just speaking for myself, and again with the disclaimer that was noted by Mike at the outset, I don't think we're in a race against Trump. I think it remains to be seen, but we need to remember that there's a broad bipartisan consensus in our country, in the US, in support of Ukraine. Now, if you dig into the details of that, you might see the Republicans, self-identified Republicans, tend to support that at a lower rate than Democrats do, but there's still pretty strong support for aiding Ukraine. Those Republicans in the mainstream that aren't as strong as that in that support, they want to see primarily more accountability. And so you might have seen just yesterday, a couple of US senators were extolling the appointment of a new inspector general for Ukraine aid. In their view, I think there were 4 Republicans, senators, that came out and said this was really a fantastic appointment and they look forward to working with this person. So I don't think we're in a race just yet. It remains to be seen what will happen, of course, over the next year and a half as our election unfolds. But I don't think we're at that point yet.
If I could jump in and add, we may be, unfortunately, in a race against American public opinion. There was a CNN poll that the data was gathered in late August, but it was released a week or so ago that showed 55% of Americans are against further aid to Ukraine and 45% are for. And among Republicans, it's 71% against. Among Democrats, it's 62% for. So there is a partisan political split, but and the preferences of the American public don't directly translate into policy, right? They're filtered up through the institutions, through the Congress and through the White House. And the White House can lead, but I think we're at a point where the White House needs to lead. We need to start talking to the American people directly about why this is in our interest to continue to support Ukraine. Because if American public opinion has tipped, as that CNN poll indicates it has, then every increment of further support to Ukraine is going to be more difficult to get through Congress to those that need to go through Congress. I think drawdown still doesn't. Presidential drawdown authority, the White House can just do. But we're at a point where I think we have to make a case to the American people because public opinion appears to be slipping or tipping.
Okay, and one last question, then Dr. Lynch, I'll kick it back to you for final closing comments.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Juliana Harris. I'm with the Canadian Department of National Defence. And I'd like to very much pick up on this very last comment in your response and talk about the battle of the narratives, both within our own information environment and when it comes to the global South. I think one of the more sobering realizations of the last year and a half has been both the fragility or shallowness of support, even within the certain members of the alliance, and probably almost within every country within the alliance, and the fact that 3 out of 4 countries in the world have chosen to subordinate their long-term security interests to other objectives, shorter-term objectives, economic and otherwise. And so that begs the question, how do we go about sustaining that vital support from our own publics and growing the multinational coalition of support for countering Russian aggression? And just as to sort of tee up what I hope will be kind of a wide-ranging response across the panel, I would offer that when we frame the case for countering Russian aggression, both to our own publics and vis-a-vis partners in the global South, we oftentimes speak of the dichotomy between autocracy and democracy. And reflecting on yesterday's discussion around human security, and having a deep understanding of the dynamics in the region that we speak of, that there's a lot of truth to this. for Ukrainians themselves, much of this fight is about a way of life and about fundamental values that we happen to share. That said, in terms of finding common ground and reaching those who a year and a half in are not on board with our conception of the world and how we govern our own societies, I would offer that we emphasize more, not just the RBIO, the rules-based order dimension, but bring greater precision to how we talk about the rules-based order. I think many of us have found ourselves in discussions with representatives of the Global South who very quickly push back on the rules-based order reference by opening up a whole debate around how the rules-based order has not favored them over the course of many decades, sort of abstracting from the immediate. And so oftentimes I find that we lose an opportunity to talk namely about what's different about this case compared to all other cases or many other cases, and namely it's the violation of the norm against territorial conquest. It is the incidence, the risk of greater incidence of and brutality of interstate war. And I think it's that dynamic that can help to focus discussion and narrow down opportunities for folks to wiggle out of serious conversations around countering Russian aggression. Over to you.
I'll take a crack on the narrative on rules-based order. I think our narrative needs to be a little nuanced, right? I mean, because in the global South, and there are many people, I think, who believe the Russian narrative that it's not a rules-based order. It's a U.S. hegemonic order, and the U.S. by the Chinese narrative too, right? And the U.S. is just trying to protect its position as the hegemon. And this war, for a different project, I was in Africa last year doing research in South Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya, and I got a lot of this. Hey, you have to understand that down here, the understanding of this war is at least as much about NATO enlargement and pushing an alliance toward Russia's borders as it is about some sort of Russian post-imperial hangover. So, I think part of the narrative needs to be, no, this is a rules. There are rules, and the United States is not a hegemonic power. It routinely subordinates. It routinely doesn't do things that it could do based on its power because it follows the rules of the system that it established in the post-World War II era. And that the alternative is a system of polarity where the vast majority of states, of countries in the world, will have their sovereignty subordinated to some sort of regional hegemon, right? I mean, I think the Chinese view is a bipolar world. Beijing and Washington run the world. I think the Russian view is a multipolar world in which Russia is a pole. But I think the narrative to people in the global South is this subordinates your interests to some sort of self-designated regional hegemon, and you lose the ability to conduct your own economic policy, your own foreign policy, your own security policy, which you have under a rules-based order, as long as the institutions and norms and rules that govern the system are respected more broadly. It gives smaller powers agency that they would lack under the Russian or the Russian-Chinese preferred system.
Okay, well, I hate to cut it off there, but I think that looks like the end of the comments. And so, Dr. Lynch, I'll pass it over to you for some quick closing comments.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. And thanks to everyone there at the conference for all your insightful questions and comments. Once again, I'd like to thank KCIS for the opportunity to present and share views today, and especially our 18-year partners with CIDP, Director Dr. Stephanie Martell, Deputy Director Dr. Howard Combs, and the inimitable Maureen Bartram, the manager. I'd also like to acknowledge our own U.S. Army War College Fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Tyler Dennell, for his assistance. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much from the Army War College.
Please give him a hand.